Welcome to another Werewolf Shifter Romance audiobook. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Elizabeth Whitaker eased her foot off the gas pedal as her car rolled into Harmony, the sleepy town unfolding before her like something out of an old postcard. Brick buildings lined cobbled streets, their facades painted in soft pastels. Flower boxes spilled over with autumn blooms, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh-baked bread. It was the kind of place where time seemed slow, where strangers offered warm smiles and waved like they'd known you for years. She sighed, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. This is it. Fresh start, new job, no drama, no more sleepless nights haunted by an ex who didn't know the meaning of closure, no more city noise clawing at her nerves, just peace. Quiet. Her gaze drifted to a weathered mural on the side of a general store. A massive wolf painted in dark, sweeping strokes, golden eyes piercing and intent. The fur along the creature's back was bristled, as if it could leap off the wall and devour the world whole. It shouldn't have unnerved her, but it did. Something in those painted eyes sent a shiver down her spine. Get a grip, Liz. Parking in front of the school, she grabbed her tote bag and headed inside, the echo of her boots clicking against polished wood floors. The classroom was cozy, with wide windows letting in the soft morning light. She ran her fingers over the rows of desks, breathing in the faint scent of chalk and old books. This is home now. Hours later, after unpacking books and decorating bulletin boards with colourful paper cutouts, she found herself at the local cafe. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped in, warmth and the aroma of fresh coffee wrapping around her like a blanket. Conversations hummed in the background, mingling with the clinking of mugs and soft jazz playing overhead. New face, the barista, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, smiled. Teacher, right? Small-town news travels fast. Elizabeth chuckled. Guilty as charged. Elizabeth Whitaker. Well, welcome to Harmony, Elizabeth. First coffee's on the house. Gratefully accepting the steaming cup, she glanced around, her gaze snagging on a tall figure seated at the corner table. Broad shoulders, dark hair cropped close to his scalp, and an air that practically screamed danger. But not the kind that warned you to stay away. No, this was the kind that pulled you in, made you curious enough to burn. His gaze lifted, steel-grey eyes locked with hers. Intense, assessing, predatory. Her breath caught, her pulse jumped, and he smirked. Slow, wicked. Like he knew exactly what he was doing to her. Flustered, she turned away. Get a grip, Liz. Except her body hadn't gotten the memo. Heat curled low in her belly, spreading like wildfire. What the hell was that about? Later that evening, unpacking boxes in her tiny rental cottage, her mind drifted back to him. To those eyes, that smirk, the way her skin had prickled under his gaze. She hadn't even spoken to him, and yet she felt pulled, drawn to something she couldn't explain. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves rustled like whispers just out of reach. She glanced at the window, and for a heartbeat she swore she saw eyes staring back at her from the tree line. Golden, predatory, familiar. She blinked. Gone. Her pulse pounded, adrenaline thrumming through her veins. Just nerves, new town jitters. But deep down, in that place where instincts hummed and reason faltered, she knew better. Something was watching, waiting, and for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. She wanted it to find her. Elizabeth stepped into the lively crowd at the annual Harvest Festival, the warmth of the evening air filled with the sounds of laughter, the steady beat of folk music, and the sharp scent of caramel apples. The town was vibrant, alive with the spirit of the harvest, and there was an undeniable energy in the air, a mix of celebration and something else she couldn't quite place. Children darted past her, laughing, their faces painted with bright colours. Stalls lined the street selling handmade goods and homemade treats. Lanterns hung from the trees, their golden light casting a soft glow over everything, while the smell of roasted corn and fresh pies teased her senses. She found herself wandering toward a booth that sold local crafts, her fingers brushing over the intricately woven scarves and pottery, but her mind wasn't entirely focused on the wares. She hadn't been in town long, but something about this festival, the energy, the togetherness, felt like the missing piece to the quiet life she'd sought. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the chaos of her old life. That's when she saw him. Across the crowd, a man stood near the edge of the festival, his broad frame leaning casually against a lamppost, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. He had the kind of presence that made you take notice. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his sharp jawline and rugged features gave him an almost predatory look, but it was the way he held himself, confident, composed, that drew her in. He wasn't just another man at the festival. There was something else about him, something that felt different, something that made her pulse pick up in an unexpected rush. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes snapped to hers, locking with hers across the distance. The world seemed to narrow down to that single moment, their gazes colliding with an intensity that stole her breath. His eyes were dark, not just from the night, but filled with something else, something fierce, something guarded. But there was also a softness, a warmth that contradicted the dangerous edge in his posture. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, the pull to him so strong it felt like it was coming from somewhere deep inside. His expression remained unreadable, but there was no mistaking the flicker of something... recognition? Passing between them? She couldn't tear her eyes away, and neither could he. Her breath hitched, her mind spinning. It was just a look, nothing more, but it felt like more. Much more. Finally, as if shaken from the spell, Luke pushed off the post and started toward her, his movements smooth and purposeful. Her stomach fluttered at the approach, her heart thudding in her chest as he closed the distance between them. Enjoying the festival? His voice was deep, with a rich timbre that resonated in her chest. There was a calmness to him, but also something that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Yeah," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady, but the tremor of excitement barely contained. "It's a nice change from the city." She found herself stepping closer, almost instinctively, as if she wanted to be near him, to close the distance that felt too far. He nodded, his gaze moving over her with a quiet intensity, as if weighing her words. "It's a good place to reset." His eyes narrowed slightly, and his lips curled into a knowing smile. "I'm Luke, sheriff of this fine town." Elizabeth couldn't help the small, surprised laugh that escaped her lips. "You're the sheriff?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He had the kind of presence that suggested authority, but she hadn't expected him to be the one in charge here. "Yeah," he said with a simple shrug, his expression a mix of self-awareness and amusement. "It's a quiet job around here, most of the time." There was an edge to his words, a hint that the quiet wasn't as serene as it appeared. "And you are Elizabeth?" She offered her hand, and he took it without hesitation, his grip strong but not overpowering. His touch sent a shiver through her, a spark that ignited something deep inside. She noticed the calluses on his fingers, the small signs of someone who worked hard, someone who knew his way around a dangerous world. "You're new in town?" he asked, his voice low, as his gaze held hers a little longer than necessary, a flash of something deep, as though he was trying to figure her out. "Yeah, just moved here recently," she said, her heart skipping a beat under the weight of his stare. "Needed a change of scenery." "I get that," Luke said, his lips quirking into a smile. "Sometimes we all need a fresh start." His eyes softened just slightly, the usual hardness in his gaze fading for a moment. "I think you'll like it here. There's something special about this place." Elizabeth nodded, her chest tightening at the way his words settled over her. Something special. She felt it too, the pull of something ancient, something that wasn't just in the town, but in the way Luke made her feel. "Do you always work the festival?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Not usually," he said, his smile deepening. "But tonight felt different. I figured I'd keep an eye on things." The way he said it made it clear he was more than capable of handling whatever came his way. There was no arrogance in his voice, only the quiet confidence that came with knowing what you were capable of, and knowing how to protect those around you. They stood there for a beat, a comfortable silence falling between them, the hum of the festival continuing around them. But the air between them was charged, the weight of their unspoken connection hanging heavy. Elizabeth shifted, not wanting to break the moment, but also unsure of how to continue. "So, do you have any recommendations? What's good here?" Luke chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made her heart flutter. "The caramel apples are a must," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "And if you're feeling brave, try the haunted house over there. Some of the local kids are too jumpy to work it, but it's a good laugh." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, her smile playful. "Sounds like something I'd survive." His smile deepened, but there was something almost predatory about the way he looked at her now. "I think you'd do more than survive." His words lingered in the space between them, charged with an energy she couldn't quite understand but couldn't ignore. Something about him made her feel both exposed and safe, a paradox that stirred a quiet hunger deep inside. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice a little breathless, though she wasn't sure why. Luke took a step back, his gaze never leaving hers. "Maybe I'll see you around then. It's a small town after all." She nodded, her chest tight as she tried to steady her breathing. Maybe. As he turned to walk away, a flicker of something, of recognition of something more, lingered in the space between them, and as much as she tried to ignore it, she knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Elizabeth's heart raced as she walked along the darkened streets of Harmony. The town felt different tonight, off. It had been a strange few days, with the locals whispering about odd occurrences. The animals acted spooked. Strange howls echoed in the distance, sending chills down her spine. But tonight, as she walked home from the library, those whispers seemed louder in her ears. The air was thick with tension. Her boots clicked against the pavement, each step pulling her closer to the quiet cottage she'd called home for the past week. But no matter how fast she walked, something gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She stopped, pressing a hand to her chest, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. There was no one around, just the dim light from the street lamps and the eerie silence of the night. A sudden howl split the air. Not the sound of a coyote or a stray dog. This was different. Low, throaty and raw. It sent a shock of fear through her. Her body tensed, every instinct screaming that she wasn't safe. The sound came again, closer this time. Her breath hitched as the chill of the night wrapped around her like a second skin. "Should I run?" She turned her gaze toward the tree line, but the darkness swallowed the distance. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, and she forced herself to keep walking, but the howl seemed to follow her, closer now, almost as if it was calling her. "It's just the wind," she told herself, but even she didn't believe it. Her steps quickened, her pulse pounded harder in her ears, and then, in the distance, a shadow moved. A flash of movement so fast she nearly missed it. No, not think about it, just keep walking. But as her breath caught in her throat, her mind turned to Luke. The way he'd looked at her earlier today. The fire in his eyes, the intensity. There was something about him that wasn't human. He carried a weight that tugged at her chest, a constant reminder that there were things in this town she didn't understand. Things that felt like secrets. Dark ones. At the sheriff's office, Luke stared at the old case files spread out before him. His fingers hovered over the weathered paper as he skimmed through the pages, looking for anything that would explain the unease growing in him. The curse that had haunted this town for generations wasn't just a myth. He knew that, and now with Elizabeth's arrival, he could feel the shift in the air, the pull of fate drawing them both into something neither of them could control. His wolf clawed at his skin, restless, waiting for something, someone, her. She didn't know yet. didn't realize that she was tied to the curse, to him, but it was only a matter of time before she'd figure it out. He pushed the file aside, his gaze drifting to the window. The moon hung high in the sky, its light casting long shadows across the streets. He'd kept his distance, but tonight he could feel her even in the quiet. Her scent lingered, sweet and intoxicating, a mix of warmth and vulnerability. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides. The pull to be near her, to claim her, was overwhelming. But there was something else, something darker. The curse wasn't just about him and Elizabeth. It was about power, control, and fate, and every time he was near her, every time he let that bond between them grow, he felt it tightening around them both. Back at the school, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that the town's secrets were buried, somewhere she could reach if only she knew where to look. Something, someone, was guiding her toward the answers. Her eyes fell on the dusty old diary she'd found tucked away in the back of the school archives. The pages were yellowed with age, but the words jumped out at her. They spoke of a curse, of ancient rites and bloodlines. Her heart skipped a beat as she read a passage that chilled her to the bone. The wolf and the woman, destined to awaken the darkness that sleeps beneath the earth. A bond forged in blood, a bond that cannot be undone. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced. She was part of this, her arrival here, her connection to Luke. It was all written in the stars. But that wasn't the part that made her head spin. It was the mention of the curse, the bond and the darkness. She slammed the book shut, her mind swirling with the implications. What had she gotten herself into? Later that night, when Elizabeth finally made her way back to her cottage, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The howl still echoed in her mind, haunting her thoughts, and the cold night air pressed against her skin like a warning. And then, in the distance, she saw him, Luke, standing in the shadows, his eyes gleaming with something she couldn't name. Without a word, he stepped into the moonlight, his powerful frame moving with a fluidity that made her heart race. His gaze didn't leave hers as he approached, slow and deliberate. "Elizabeth," he said, voice low and intense. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the pull of something ancient in his eyes, something he hadn't shared with her yet. "Let me help you," he said, his voice a command wrapped in warmth. "But you have to trust me." She could see the struggle in his eyes. He was fighting it, whatever it was. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You will," he promised. His lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it, only darkness. "But for now, just know. We're tied together, no matter how far you try to run." Her breath hitched, the words settling heavy in her chest. Something inside her knew he wasn't just talking about the curse, he was talking about them. Her pulse quickened, the air between them thick with tension. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, he stepped forward, his body pressing against hers, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both possessive and tender, and she kissed him back. Elizabeth sat across from Luke in the secluded corner of the library, the air between them thick with something unspoken. The quiet of the library, the soft rustle of pages turning, felt distant compared to the hum of electricity pulsing beneath her skin. The more they dug into the town's strange history, the more the pieces fit together in a way that made her heart race and her pulse quicken. She glanced up at him, her fingers tracing the edge of an old book, her thoughts wandering. "You ever wonder if we're meant to uncover these things?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I mean, the town's been hiding these secrets for so long, and now, here we are, finding them." Luke leaned back in his chair, his intense gaze never leaving hers. He looked like he was studying her, trying to figure out whether she was truly asking the question or if it was just a way to fill the silence between them. "You get it, do you?" His voice was rough, more vulnerable than she was used to hearing. "You're not just a part of this because you came to solve a mystery. You're here because you're meant to be." His words lingered, the weight of them sinking into her chest. Her throat tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She'd sensed something from the moment they met. something that couldn't be ignored, something that connected them. But hearing him say it so openly, with that look in his eyes, left her breathless. "I don't know what you mean." Her voice was almost a whisper, betraying her confusion and the sudden depth of feeling she didn't quite understand. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, his gaze narrowing slightly, as though he were torn between saying more or holding back. "I've never told anyone this," he began, his voice low but steady, "but I've always known there was something different about me. The way I feel, the way my instincts are sharper than most. It's not just my job, it's in my blood." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I've spent my life fighting it, but you've come here and I can't ignore it anymore." Elizabeth's breath caught as his words hit her like a sudden wave. He wasn't talking just about the town or its secrets anymore. He was talking about himself, about them. Before she could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, barely a graze, but it sent a shock through her, like a jolt of electricity zipping up her arm and settling deep in her chest. Her pulse quickened. She looked at his hand, then up at his face, her heart hammering in her ears. The connection between them felt undeniable. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, primal, a bond that neither of them could escape, no matter how hard they tried. Luke's breath was shallow now, his eyes dark with an intensity she didn't recognize. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her heart was in her throat, her body taut with anticipation, and as much as she wanted to pull back, she couldn't. Without another word, Luke moved closer. His presence seemed to fill the space, pulling her toward him as if some invisible force had tethered them together. His hand was still on hers, and now, as he leaned in, she felt the heat of his breath against her skin. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough but with a tenderness that sent a shiver down her spine. "I've spent my whole life alone with this, afraid of the power I can't control, but you make me want to give in." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment she felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest. She was drawn to him in a way that made no sense. He was everything she thought she should stay away from, but every part of her wanted to move closer, to lose herself in him. Before she could process any of her thoughts, his lips captured hers. The kiss was slow at first, almost tentative, as if they were both testing the waters. But the moment their mouths met, something shifted. It was as if their souls recognized each other in the quiet of the library, a connection that stretched beyond reason, beyond logic. His hand cupped her jaw, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss, and that was all it took. Her body responded immediately, her arms winding around his neck as she melted into him. Every instinct screamed at her to give in to him completely, to let go of the doubts and confusion and feel. Luke's body was solid against hers, the heat radiating from him, making her skin burn, and she knew that this wasn't just a kiss. It was the beginning of something neither of them could walk away from. His tongue swept into her mouth, tasting, claiming her, and she responded in kind, matching the intensity of his need. The pull between them was undeniable now, thick with desire, with something more than just physical attraction. This was a bond, an awakening of something ancient and powerful, and as he deepened the kiss, she felt herself falling into him, into whatever was waiting for them. When they finally pulled away, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. His hands were still on her, holding her close, as if he feared she might disappear if he let go. "You're mine," he said, his voice low, raw, and full of conviction. "Whether you understand it or not, you're mine." The words settled over her like a promise, a weight she didn't know how to carry. But at that moment, for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth didn't want to fight it. She didn't want to deny what was between them, because no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, she knew deep down that it was real, and whatever this bond was, whatever power it held, she was ready to embrace it with him. Elizabeth stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths as she looked at Luke. The weight of the conversation between them lingered, heavy with something she couldn't fully understand. Her heart beat erratically, both from the intensity of the connection they shared and the fear that had crept in, threatening to pull her under. Luke's usual confidence was gone, his eyes dark with emotion. She saw something raw in him, something that terrified her but also made her want to move closer. It was the vulnerability she hadn't expected from someone like him. He was a force, a man who commanded attention and power, yet now he stood in front of her as if stripped of all defenses. "I don't want to drag you into this," Luke said, his voice low, and she could hear the weight of every word. "You don't know what it's like fighting this thing inside me. I'm not a normal man, Elizabeth. I never have been." She took a step toward him, her heart aching for him in a way she didn't know was possible. "You don't have to face this alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt fragile, but they were the truth. No matter what he was, she wasn't going to turn away from him. He let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get it. The darkness in me, it's not just a part of who I am, it's all I am." His jaw tightened as he looked away, hands clenched at his sides, as though he were holding himself back from reaching for her. "I'm trying so damn hard to keep it contained, but with you," his gaze flicked to hers, raw and honest, "with you it's harder. You make me want things I can't have." She swallowed, her chest tight. She had known this, felt it deep in her gut. There was something about him that scared her, a primal force she could never fully understand. But there was also something she couldn't deny. The pull between them was real. He wasn't the only one fighting it. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The confession slipped out, surprising even her. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't seem to walk away from it, and part of me doesn't want to." His eyes softened and the tension between them seemed to lessen, but the intensity was still there. "Elizabeth!" His voice was like gravel, deep and full of raw emotion. He reached for her then, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently brushing across her skin. The touch was tender, a stark contrast to the storm inside him. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I can't stand the thought of losing you. But I'm not sure if I'm strong enough to stay in control, to give you the kind of love you deserve." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. "I don't need perfect. I just need you to be real." Her voice cracked as the weight of her own vulnerability settled over her like a blanket. "We can figure this out, Luke. Together. I'm not going anywhere." His hand slid down her neck, pulling her closer until they were inches apart. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and steady, but the heat between them was almost unbearable. His chest rose and fell with every breath, his heart racing in rhythm with hers. "You're too good for me," he whispered, his words low but full of conviction. His eyes were dark now, the usual dominance in them replaced by something deeper, something raw. "I don't deserve you." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She reached up, touching his face, feeling the roughness of his skin under her fingertips. "You're not alone anymore, Luke. You'll never have to be." His lips found hers then, fierce but tender. The kiss was a mix of all their fears, all their hopes, each one wrapped in the other. She could feel his hands tightening around her waist, pulling her flush against him, as though he needed her to understand just how much he wanted her. But it wasn't just the physical need that consumed them, it was the emotional connection. The bond that had formed between them was undeniable, and each kiss, each touch, only brought them closer. Their hearts were exposed, their fears raw, but in that moment there was no turning back. Luke's hands slid to the small of her back, pulling her impossibly closer, and she gasped into the kiss, her body pressing against his. The heat between them was suffocating, overwhelming, but it felt like the only thing that made sense. He groaned softly, his grip on her tightening, as if he were trying to hold on to something he feared might slip away. "I need you, Elizabeth," he growled against her lips, the words laced with a mix of desperation and tenderness. "I don't know how to stop this, how to fight it. She kissed him harder, her hands threading through his hair, tugging him closer. "Then don't fight it." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her voice thick with emotion. "Let it happen. Let us happen." The words were all he needed. The tension between them shattered in an instant, and Luke pulled her into him, claiming her with a hunger that left her breathless. Every kiss, every touch was filled with that same raw need, a need to give everything, to be consumed by each other. And in that moment, as their bodies and hearts collided, Elizabeth realized something. This bond, this connection, was more than just fate. It was the beginning of everything she had ever wanted, even if it scared the hell out of her. Luke wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but together they were something stronger than fear, stronger than anything they could have ever imagined. Elizabeth sat across from Luke, their bodies pressed together in the cramped study nook, surrounded by ancient records and dusty books, their hands brushing more often than necessary. The air between them was thick with more than just the musty scent of old paper. Something was building between them, something neither of them wanted to ignore anymore. They had been digging through town legends, following breadcrumbs about a curse that had plagued this place for centuries. Each turn led them closer, but each discovery only seemed to pull them further into the web of fate. It wasn't just the curse they were unraveling, it was them. The bond between them that was both electric and terrifying. "I don't know what to make of this," Elizabeth said, her voice low as she sifted through another faded page. Her fingers trembled just slightly, a stark contrast to her usual calm demeanor. Luke, sitting next to her, noticed and reached out, his hand closing around hers without hesitation. His grip was strong, possessive in the most subtle way, as though marking her as his. The touch grounded her, but also stirred something deep in her. "You don't have to make sense of it yet," Luke replied, his voice low, the edge of urgency in it that made her shiver. "But you need to understand. The bond we share, it's not just some coincidence. It's fate." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he continued. "And we're tied to this curse more than we realize." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest, not just from the revelations in the book, but from the way his presence filled the space. Every inch of him felt like a force she couldn't resist. "I'm not scared of this," she said softly, more to herself than to him. His gaze darkened as he slowly pulled her closer, the space between them disappearing. "You should be," he whispered, the words laced with a warning, but his lips were so close to hers, she could feel the heat of them. He wasn't just talking about the curse anymore. She could feel his desire building, raw, unrelenting. Before she could respond, the door creaked open and the elderly historian stepped in. His eyes immediately darted to the two of them, narrowing slightly as if he had seen something he wasn't supposed to. "You two seem close," he said, his voice gravelly with age and something darker. Luke didn't let go of her hand. He just met the historian's gaze and said, "We're here to uncover the truth, the curse, the bond. Whatever this town is hiding, we want to know." The historian's expression hardened. He crossed the room slowly, as though considering whether or not to divulge the information. "You think you're ready for this?" he asked quietly, but there was an undertone to his words that made Elizabeth's pulse quicken. "It's not just a curse. It's a bond, one that will awaken powers you aren't prepared for." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her mind racing. She turned to Luke, but he was already looking at her, his face a mask of determination and something darker. "We're ready," he said simply, as if it were the only thing he could say. The historian nodded slowly, a sigh escaping his lips as he lowered himself into a chair. "This curse has been passed down for generations," he began, his voice quiet. "It's tied to the bond between two beings, one human, one supernatural. A union meant to awaken ancient power, but also unleash a darkness that has been buried for centuries." Elizabeth's heart skipped. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "And that's us?" she asked, the words hanging in the air between them, heavy with the weight of what it could mean. The historian nodded, his expression grim. "You don't understand what you're walking into," he said. his tone edged with something like pity. "You're the key. The curse is bound to you now, and when the bond is fully realized, when it's awakened, you won't just be fighting a curse. You'll be fighting a war." Elizabeth's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away from Luke. Instead, she squeezed his hand tighter, as though drawing strength from him. The pull between them had always been undeniable, but now it felt like something more. Something far more dangerous. Yet even with that fear simmering inside her, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Luke's voice was low, but filled with command. "Tell us what we need to do." The historian hesitated before he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "You need to understand that the bond you share isn't just physical. It's emotional, spiritual, and it's powerful. It'll change everything about you, about how you see the world, how you interact with it. It'll awaken something inside of you that's dormant. It'll make you stronger, but also more dangerous. If you're not careful, the curse could consume you both." Elizabeth's pulse was racing, but Luke's grip on her hand didn't waver. She could feel the tension between them, thick and heady, as if they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't control. "What happens when it awakens?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. The historian's gaze flicked to Luke and then back to her. "You'll know when it happens, and when it does, there's no going back." Luke turned to her then, his eyes intense, holding her gaze with a mixture of desire and warning. She could see it, the raw primal hunger in him that matched the ache in her own chest. He wasn't just talking about the curse anymore. It was more than that. It was the pull between them, the bond that had grown stronger with every passing day. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her lips. "We're in this together, Elizabeth. We'll face whatever comes, together." His lips brushed against hers, just a whisper of a kiss. But it was enough to send sparks of heat spiraling through her body. Her breath hitched, her body responding before her mind could catch up. She wanted him, needed him, but beneath that desire was something else, something deeper, a connection that went beyond the physical, beyond the curse. "Together," she echoed softly, her heart beating faster at the thought of facing everything that was coming, the curse, the power, the danger. They would face it together. And no matter what, they wouldn't walk away from each other. Not now, not ever. As Luke leaned in to kiss her again, deeper this time, the world outside the small room seemed to vanish. All that mattered was the connection between them, the bond that was awakening, unstoppable and fierce. Whatever darkness awaited them, they would face it, side by side. Luke's hand was on the page before her, his fingers grazing the old leather-bound journal as if he could feel the weight of the curse etched in its words. The air around them was thick, charged with a strange kind of electricity. The legends they had uncovered, about a bond, about the curse, had tied them together in ways neither of them had fully understood until now. Elizabeth's breath caught as she leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his, their bodies nearly aligned in the small nook of the study. His proximity stirred something deep inside her, something primal, something that made her senses flare to life. The quiet hum of the room, the rustling of pages. There was only him, only the feeling of being drawn to him in a way that felt both frightening and undeniable. "I don't think this is just coincidence." Luke's voice broke the silence, rough and low. His eyes never left the text, but there was something in the way he held her gaze, something that made the back of her neck tingle. Elizabeth's heart raced. She could feel it too. The bond between them pulling tighter, the way their connection seemed to trigger something unseen. "You think the curse is real?" she asked, her voice steady, though the question was more for herself than for him. "Not think," Luke replied, his fingers brushing against hers as he flipped through the pages. "I know it is." Just then, the temperature in the room dropped. A shiver ran through her, her skin suddenly icy despite the warmth of the space. She looked at Luke, who stiffened, his sharp gaze darting around the room as though searching for something. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luke nodded, his eyes narrowing. "The bond! It's waking up!" Before she could respond, a cold gust of wind blew through the small window, despite it being tightly shut. The flames in the fireplace flickered, casting strange shadows against the walls. A soft glow began to creep over the horizon. The moon, large and full, seemed to shine brighter than ever before, its light casting an eerie glow into the room. Elizabeth's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just the wind, it was the curse. It was them. "Something's happening," she whispered, as the temperature dropped even further, the chill seeping into her bones. Luke stood quickly, moving toward the window, his body rigid with tension. "We need to leave. Now." She stood too, but not without hesitation. There was a strange pull in the air, something that both terrified and excited her. Her gaze locked on him, the bond between them sparking again, raw, undeniable. He turned toward her, his expression darkening as he closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides. Before she could even respond, his lips were on hers, firm, demanding, and full of something that made her knees weak. He pulled her flush against him, the heat of his body instantly warming her, making her forget everything but him. His hands slid around her waist, pressing her body to his as he deepened the kiss. There was no gentleness in it. This was a kiss of raw need, an urgent claiming of something that neither of them could deny any longer. She melted into him, her hands moving to his chest, feeling the hard, heated muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. He pulled away just enough to look at her, his breathing heavy, his lips swollen from the kiss. "I'm not letting you go," he growled, his voice thick with an edge of control she had never heard before. Her heart raced. "Luke?" Her voice trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was desire, raw and untamed. "I won't be able to control this much longer," he whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. "The bond is too strong, and I—" His breath faltered for a moment, his eyes dark with a mixture of hunger and something else, something deeper. "I need you." His hands moved down to her hips, his fingers tightening as he pulled her closer. She could feel the heat of him, his body pressed against hers, but there was something else in the air now. It wasn't just desire. It was a raw power, the kind that made her feel both vulnerable and protected at the same time. The distant sound of voices in the town square carried through the open window, and Elizabeth's mind flashed to the townspeople. Their whispers, their distrust of her. She pulled back slightly, her hand still resting on his chest, though it felt almost impossible to break the connection between them. "Luke," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "The town—" "I don't care about the town," he growled, his fingers grazing her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. "I care about you." His lips hovered just above hers. "And I won't let anyone take you from me." Her heart hammered in her chest. The intensity of his words, the way he held her as if she were something precious he couldn't bear to lose, left her breathless. The bond between them was only getting stronger, and with it came a dangerous, undeniable pull. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized something. She didn't want to fight it any more. She didn't want to hold back. She was tied to him, body and soul, and no matter what came next, she would face it by his side. As if sensing her resolve, Luke's expression softened, the storm inside him still present but more controlled. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice firm. "The curse, the town, whatever comes. You're mine now, and I won't let anything tear us apart." The bond between them flared again, stronger than before, more alive, like a flame that could never be extinguished. The world outside, the whispers of the townsfolk, all faded away as Elizabeth stood there, in Luke's arms, knowing that no matter what happened, they were in this fight together, and nothing, no curse, no danger, could change that. The sound of footsteps behind them was a warning. Too quiet at first, barely a whisper, but growing louder as they hurried through the dense forest. Luke's breath was ragged as he gripped Elizabeth's hand, pulling her along faster. The full moon above bathed the woods in an eerie glow, illuminating the dark, twisting path they were following. Every step felt heavier, more urgent, as if something dark and unseen was closing in on them. Elizabeth's heart raced, her mind too foggy with fear to keep up with the wild pace Luke set. She stumbled once, her foot catching on a tree root, but he was there in an instant, lifting her effortlessly, keeping them both moving. She could feel the strength in his grip, the raw power of his wolf just under the surface. The tension in his body was palpable, his muscles straining, the familiar hum of his dominance radiating between them like an invisible pull. "They're getting closer." Luke's voice was low, tense, his jaw clenched. "We need to keep moving." Elizabeth glanced back, but the shadows swallowed the trail behind them. There was no sign of their pursuers, but she could feel them, could sense the darkness closing in, the presence of something dangerous, something that wanted them both to fail. The cult. The power they were chasing had drawn them into something far bigger than they'd realized. The bond between her and Luke, the connection they shared, was now the thing that made them targets. "I won't let them take you," Luke said, his voice more of a growl than a whisper. He squeezed her hand, pulling her tighter into his side as they veered left, dodging through the trees with the precision of wolves on a hunt. "I'm not going anywhere," Elizabeth replied, her voice breathless but firm. The fear that gripped her chest only fueled her resolve. She wouldn't let anyone tear them apart, not now, not when they were so close to understanding the curse and what it meant for them. She'd come too far to turn back. The sound of a twig snapping behind them made her freeze, her heart leaping into her throat. She didn't need to turn around to know that their pursuers were closing in. There was a rustling in the trees, a shift in the air that told her they were being hunted. She looked up at Luke, his jaw clenched, his eyes glowing silver in the moonlight. She'd never seen him look like this. Wild, untamed, ready for battle. "I'll keep you safe, Elizabeth," Luke growled, his voice thick with the animalistic edge that was always just under the surface. "Trust me." Before she could respond, he moved with incredible speed, his hand never leaving hers as they tore through the forest. She stumbled to keep up with him, the wind rushing past her, the world a blur of dark trees and sharp branches. Her mind raced, but there was no time to think, only to survive. The crunch of leaves behind them echoed, and Elizabeth's instincts screamed at her to run faster. She could hear them now, footsteps pounding, closing in on them from all directions. The cult was getting closer. Her heart was pounding in her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, with no warning, a figure emerged from the trees, a man in dark robes, his face obscured by a hood. He lunged toward them, but before Elizabeth could even react, Luke was there, his movements a blur. He slammed the man into the ground with a growl that made Elizabeth's blood run cold, his eyes glowing with the fierce power of his wolf. The stranger struggled, but Luke's grip was unrelenting. "You need to run," Luke said, his voice low, filled with a primal command that made Elizabeth's skin heat. "I'll deal with them." "No!" Elizabeth shook her head, her grip tightening on Luke's arm. "We're in this together." Luke looked at her, his eyes dark with both the wolf's dominance and something else, something far deeper. "Trust me, Elizabeth," he growled, and there was no question in his voice. She could feel the weight of his need to protect her, to ensure her safety at all costs. He wasn't giving her a choice. With one last lingering look, he turned back to the man on the ground, his hands shifting, claws extending as the wolf within him fought to break free. Elizabeth didn't want to leave him, but the urgency in his eyes forced her to act. She ran, her legs burning, the cold air filling her lungs. The woods felt like a labyrinth, twisting and turning in every direction, but she kept moving. She trusted Luke. She had to. A sharp, guttural scream echoed behind her, but she refused to look back. Her pulse pounded, adrenaline rushing through her veins, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. She could still feel the bond between them alive, pulsing with every beat of her heart. The ground beneath her feet changed, the earth softening as she pushed forward. She spotted an open clearing up ahead, the moonlight brighter here, casting long shadows across the ground. Her breath caught in her throat when she realized she was out of the woods, but she wasn't safe yet. Before she could make it farther, a dark figure stepped into the clearing, blocking her path. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Another cult member, this one tall, with a sneer curling his lips. "You think you can escape?" he spat, his eyes glinting with malice. He raised his hands, dark energy swirling around them like smoke. Elizabeth's heart raced, but she didn't back down, not now. She could feel the rush of her blood, the strength of the bond she shared with Luke, fueling her, making her braver than she ever thought possible. The air shifted then, electric, heavy. The figure's sneer faltered as a low growl rumbled from behind her. She felt it. The rush of power, the strength of Luke's presence returning. She turned just as Luke emerged from the trees, his wolf form fully present, eyes burning silver in the night. The shift had happened so quickly it took her breath away, but there was no mistaking the power in him now. He was a force, and anyone who stood against him was about to learn that. "Get away from her," Luke growled, his voice deep, primal. The cult member took a step back, his eyes wide with shock and fear, but it was too late. Luke moved like lightning, his wolf form a blur of muscle and power as he launched himself at the man, pinning him to the ground. Elizabeth's heart raced as she watched Luke, her bond with him stronger than ever. She felt every move he made, the power of him, the connection that ran so deep she couldn't tell where he ended and she began. In that moment, as the danger passed and the moon hung high above, she knew one thing for certain. No matter the threats, no matter the darkness that lurked, they would face it together, because nothing, no curse, no cult, could ever tear them apart. The forest was silent, save for the rapid rhythm of their footsteps and the pounding of their hearts. The chase had started out as an adrenaline rush, but now, as the shadows seemed to creep closer, a dark heaviness weighed on Elizabeth's chest. Every step forward felt like they were being dragged deeper into something they couldn't control. Luke was beside her, his movements fluid, his body tense with the same urgency she felt. The bond between them, strong and powerful, a tether neither of them could deny, seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, as though the forest itself was responding to their fear. "There's something wrong," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I know," Luke growled under his breath, his fingers tightening around hers as they ran. "Something darker than we're prepared for." She glanced at him, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face. He was holding it together, but just barely. She could feel his internal struggle. His wolf, the primal part of him, demanding to fight, to protect, to dominate. But there was something more. A feeling deep inside that they weren't just fighting a curse. They were fighting their connection, too. "Luke." She slowed her pace, forcing him to stop. "What if this bond isn't just fate? What if it's a curse? What if we're making everything worse?" His jaw clenched, and his eyes locked onto hers, burning with a heat that almost took her breath away. "I don't care what it's called, Elizabeth. I'm not letting it break us. Not after everything we've been through." His voice dropped lower, a growl of possessiveness curling through his words. "I will protect you no matter what." Her heart pounded in her chest, but doubt still gnawed at the edges of her mind. "But what if I'm just pulling you deeper into the darkness? What if this bond is meant to tear us apart?" Luke's expression softened, his hand moving to her cheek, his touch tender despite the urgency of the moment. "You're not pulling me into darkness. You're pulling me into something I've never wanted, but I can't deny it. Whatever happens, whatever this is, we are in this together." But Elizabeth wasn't so sure anymore. The world around them had become a blur of shadows, the sound of footsteps growing louder, closer. The cult was still after them, an unseen force that would stop at nothing to rip them apart. The pull between her and Luke was undeniable, but could it really be the salvation they'd both hoped for? Or was it the trap they'd both fallen into? "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice breaking. Luke's eyes softened, his thumb brushing across her lips as if memorizing the feel of her. His breath was ragged, and his grip on her tightened, pulling her against him. "You won't lose me, Elizabeth. But if this bond is a curse, then I'm ready to face it with you, whatever it takes." She closed her eyes, leaning into him, as the chaotic thoughts inside her mind swirled. For a moment the world seemed to pause, just them, together in this fleeting moment, with the future uncertain. Could they truly handle the storm of the curse, or were they already too far gone? A loud crack in the distance jolted them both, and in an instant the bond between them flared, feeding into the fear that had started to creep in. Their time was running out. Luke growled, pulling her tighter against him, his wolf instincts rising to the surface. "Stay close to me. Don't let go." The air was thick with anticipation, and Elizabeth could feel the shift in the atmosphere as danger approached. It wasn't just the cult they had to worry about anymore. It was the darkness inside them, the bond they could never truly escape. Luke's lips found hers in a fierce, desperate kiss. It was an answer to their fears, their doubts, and their growing desire to survive whatever the curse had in store. She kissed him back with equal urgency, feeling the intensity of everything they couldn't say in words, the need to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep together. But just as she pulled away, a soft rustling sound interrupted them. From the shadows emerged a figure, dressed in dark robes, its presence ominous and threatening. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped forward, holding something in its hand, a scroll. It was old, worn, and glowing faintly, as though it carried a power of its own. The figure held it out toward them, its voice cold, distant. "The ritual must be completed. You cannot stop it. Your bond is not a blessing. It is a key to something far worse." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine as the figure stepped closer. The words echoed in her mind, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. The cult was playing a much larger game than they had realized. The figure's eyes locked onto Elizabeth, a knowing smirk curling its lips. "There's still time to break the curse, but it will cost you more than you're willing to pay." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "A ritual that could break or seal the curse forever." Her eyes snapped to Luke, who was staring at the figure, his jaw clenched, his eyes glowing with a dangerous intensity. "We won't let you control us," Luke growled, his voice filled with a fierce protectiveness. But Elizabeth wasn't sure. The figure was right. There was more at stake now than they could have ever imagined. And in that moment, as the figure disappeared into the shadows, Elizabeth realized one terrifying truth. The future wasn't certain anymore, and their bond, it might be the only thing that could either save them or destroy them. She turned to Luke, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. "Luke, what if we're already too far gone?" His eyes softened, but his grip on her never loosened. "Then we face it together." The car's engine hummed steadily, the miles of open road stretching out before them. Elizabeth leaned her head against the window, watching the scenery blur, the quiet rush of the road and the rhythmic motion of the tires soothing something deep inside her. Beside her, Luke drove with his usual calm intensity, but there was a quiet fire in his eyes, a force she could feel without him having to say a word. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, her heart skipping as their gazes briefly met. The bond between them thrummed with a steady pulse, an undercurrent of something primal that connected them even in the silence. His jaw was tight, his hands firm on the wheel, but there was a softness to his expression, a tenderness that made her ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. He let out a slow breath, his gaze never leaving the road. "I'm fine. We're fine." But his fingers gripped the wheel a little harder, and she saw the muscles in his shoulders tense, his whole body wound tight with something more than just the task ahead. Her fingers twitched, wanting to reach out, to offer comfort, but she knew there was nothing she could say to ease the weight of what they were carrying. Not yet. They both had too many questions, too many fears. But one thing was clear. This journey, this quest they were on, was about more than just uncovering the truth. It was about facing what lay ahead together, no matter how dark it became. "I'm glad you're here with me," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She wasn't sure why it felt so important to say it, but in that moment it was the only truth she could cling to. Luke's eyes softened as he glanced at her, his lips curling into a slow smile. The warmth of it sent a wave of comfort through her, but there was something deeper in his gaze, something fierce, possessive. "Always," he said, his voice steady. "I'll never leave you." Her chest tightened at the promise, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to let go of the uncertainty swirling inside her. She reached over, her hand brushing his arm, feeling the heat of his skin even through the fabric of his shirt. His gaze flicked to her hand, and for a brief moment the tension between them shifted into something more, something deeper. "I'll follow you anywhere," she whispered, the words a vow she hadn't meant to make, but couldn't take back. Luke's hand moved, covering hers, his fingers squeezing just enough to remind her that they were in this together. The touch sent a jolt through her, the electricity of it crackling up her arm. "We'll get through this, Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and full of promise. "We always do." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There were too many things left unsaid, too many doubts that still gnawed at the edges of her heart, but with Luke beside her, those doubts seemed a little smaller. The miles passed, the world unfolding around them as they ventured deeper into the unknown. Along the way they stopped at small towns, dusty bookstores, and quiet diners, piecing together the fragments of the curse they'd been chasing. Clues seemed to appear at every turn, ancient symbols carved into walls, weathered texts with prophetic drawings, all leading them closer to the answers they needed. But the more they uncovered, the more it became clear this wasn't just about solving a mystery. This was about facing their own fears, about accepting the bond that had already begun to shape their lives in ways they couldn't deny. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they stopped at a small cabin at the edge of a secluded lake. It was quiet, isolated, the perfect place to rest, to process the revelations they'd uncovered. As they stepped out of the car, Elizabeth felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. The air was cool, but the warmth of Luke's presence beside her made it feel like nothing could touch them. He reached for her hand, his grip steady, reassuring. "This is where we're supposed to be," he said, his voice calm but filled with something deeper. His eyes met hers, and she could see the vulnerability in them, the raw emotion he kept hidden behind that fierce exterior. "We're close now, Elizabeth. We're almost there." She nodded, the weight of the journey pressing on her chest, but there was a new determination in her now. Whatever the curse was, whatever it meant for them, they would face it head-on, together. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady, her heart full. "No matter what happens, I trust you." Luke's gaze softened, his hand lifting to gently touch her face. "And I trust you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "We've already crossed too many lines to turn back now." As his lips brushed against hers, slow and deliberate, Elizabeth felt the world around them slip away. It was just the two of them, connected, bound, fighting for each other. Every touch, every kiss felt like a reaffirmation of that bond. They were in this together, and no matter what lay ahead, that was the one truth they couldn't deny. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting together, Elizabeth's breath hitched. She could feel the heat of Luke's body, his heart beating against hers in a steady rhythm. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear. Just the two of them, standing strong in the face of whatever came next. "We'll finish this," she whispered, "together." Luke's hand tightened on hers, his lips brushing her hair. "Nothing will tear us apart, Elizabeth, nothing." As they stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the bond between them pulsed with a renewed intensity. Their journey wasn't over, but together they could face anything, because no matter the trials, the doubts, or the challenges, they were already unstoppable. Elizabeth stood in the center of the old church, the sacred space now eerily quiet, its cool stone walls heavy with centuries of forgotten secrets. The ritual was about to begin, and with each passing second, the air around them grew thicker. The celestial alignment had begun, just as the ancient texts had foretold, and everything hinged on this moment. The wind outside howled, and through the narrow windows the blood moon cast a deep crimson light over the room. It was now or never. Luke moved behind her, his presence a steady force. She could feel the heat of him, the power that rippled beneath his skin. His wolf was close, almost visible, pushing against the edges of his control. The bond between them hummed with an intensity that left her breathless. "Are you ready for this?" His voice was low, but she could feel the weight of his words in her bones. Elizabeth swallowed, nodding even as uncertainty gnawed at her. They were both prepared. They had to be. The ritual could either break the curse or bind them forever in a darkness neither of them understood. But there was no turning back. "I don't know if I am," she admitted, her voice quiet as her gaze fell on the relics they'd gathered. Ancient artifacts, rare herbs, bloodstones, all necessary for the ritual. Each one was tied to a piece of the curse, each one a reminder of what they stood to lose. Luke moved closer, his strong hands cupping her face, pulling her gaze back to him. His eyes were dark with desire, but beneath that she saw something else, something raw and vulnerable. "You're not alone in this," he growled, his voice filled with determination. "No matter what happens, I'll be right here. I'm not letting go." The words settled deep in her heart, and for a moment her doubts melted away. She had him, and he had her. They were bound by more than just the curse now. They were bound by a love that had grown too powerful to deny. "I know," she whispered, leaning into his touch. Her hands found his chest, the fabric of his shirt warm under her palms. Her breath caught as his chest expanded with a deep breath. His heart beating strong beneath her fingers, she could feel every pulse of it. Luke's lips hovered above hers for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I'm scared," he confessed, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what will happen after the ritual, but I'm not scared of losing you." Elizabeth's heart skipped at his admission, a warmth spreading through her. "I'm scared too," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, "but I'm not scared of us." He kissed her then, slow, deep, desperate. It was a kiss of raw emotion, of everything they had shared up until this point. The bond between them surged as their lips met, the connection between their bodies and souls impossible to ignore. The world around them seemed to blur, the chaos of the ritual fading as they lost themselves in each other. When they broke apart, breaths shallow, the moment of vulnerability passed. Luke stepped back, his eyes still dark with desire, but there was something else in them now, something solid, something unwavering. "We do this together," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You and me. We're stronger than anything this curse can throw at us." Elizabeth nodded, her hands shaking as she moved to the center of the ritual circle. She could feel the weight of the room closing in on them. The tension was palpable, thick and suffocating. The relics were in place, the bloodstones glowing faintly under the moonlight. The air vibrated with ancient power as Luke took his place beside her, his presence a comfort despite the storm that was about to break. The moment they began the ritual, the earth seemed to tremble beneath them. The symbols carved into the stone floor began to glow, and the wind outside howled even louder, pushing against the walls. Elizabeth's heart raced as she placed her hands on the bloodstones, the heat of them seeping into her palms. She felt the energy rise, the power of the curse, of the bond they shared. The spectral forces that had been lurking in the shadows began to materialize, their forms shifting and undulating like smoke. Luke's voice broke through the chaos, deep and resonant, chanting the ancient words that would either seal their fate or free them. His hands were on her shoulders, grounding her, keeping her anchored in the storm of magic and emotion that surged through them both. She could feel him, his power, his wolf, his love, filling the space between them, wrapping them both in a blanket of strength. But there was a cost. The darker energies of the curse fought back, pushing against the ritual, twisting it, trying to corrupt it. The air thickened, the temperature dropping, as shadowy figures swirled around them, their presence cold and suffocating. Elizabeth gasped as one of the figures reached for her, its form a dark blur, but Luke was there in an instant, his hand on her arm, pulling her into him. The touch, the heat of him steadied her. "Fight it, Elizabeth," he urged, his voice urgent. "We're almost there." She nodded, closing her eyes and focusing on the bond between them, the love, the connection, the power they shared. As the curse swirled around them, threatening to break them apart, she reached for him. Her hands finding his, the heat of their connection flared, pushing back the darkness, forcing the shadows to retreat. But the battle wasn't over. The spectral figures continued to press in, their forms shifting, their voices echoing in her mind. They were getting stronger. "It's too much," Elizabeth thought for a moment, the doubt creeping in again. The energy was building too fast, the darkness too powerful. She was losing control. "Elizabeth," Luke's voice was low, steady, as his hands tightened around hers. "Focus on me. Trust me. We are stronger than this." With a breath, she closed her eyes again, sinking into him, into their bond. His presence filled her, their connection surging with a power that outshone everything else. The darkness pushed again, but now it was weaker, less sure of itself. Together they were unstoppable. The final words of the ritual came from Luke's lips, and in that moment everything changed. The power of the curse shattered, the spectral forces wailing as they were driven back, banished by the strength of their love. As the energy began to settle, Elizabeth collapsed into Luke's arms, her body shaking from the intensity of it all. He held her close, his hand in her hair, his lips pressing against her forehead as they both struggled to catch their breath. "We did it," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. Luke's lips curled into a slow smile, but there was a tenderness in his eyes. "Together," he said, his voice low with both satisfaction and something deeper. "Nothing will break us." And in that moment, as the echoes of the battle faded and the moonlight bathed them both in its glow, Elizabeth knew it was true. No curse, no darkness, no force in the world could ever tear them apart. They had faced the storm, and together they had won. The ground shook beneath Elizabeth's feet as the full force of the curse surged around them. The air crackled with energy, dark, powerful, suffocating, and as she stood next to Luke, she could feel every ounce of it. The bond between them burned brighter than ever, but so did the threat that had been stalking them since the beginning. They had come this far, fought this hard, and now, standing side by side, they were about to face everything that had kept them apart. Luke's eyes met hers, a fierce, possessive fire in them. He was still in his human form, but she could feel the wolf just under the surface, pulsing, waiting, ready to tear through anything that threatened them. His hand found hers, gripping it with a strength that made her heart race. "I won't let anything happen to you," Luke growled, his voice rough with the weight of his words. There was no hesitation in him, no doubt. She could feel his certainty in every part of her. "I don't need you to protect me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear swirling in her chest. "We fight this together." The energy around them exploded. From the shadows, figures cloaked in darkness emerged, twisted spectral forms, remnants of the curse's fury, all taking shape before their eyes. The ground trembled, as if the earth itself was reacting to the power building in the air. These weren't just enemies. They were manifestations of the curse's true power, summoned by the darkness that still clung to them both. Luke stepped forward, his body taut with the tension of the moment, but his stance never wavered. He had always been the one to shield her, to protect her, but this time there was no stepping aside. This time they would fight together, as equals. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she said, her voice low, barely audible over the growing roar of the storm around them. She stepped up beside him, standing tall despite the chaos. The bond between them sparked with undeniable intensity. She could feel his strength, his protection, but she could also feel her own, rising within her, a force she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Luke didn't look at her as he gave a sharp, curt nod, but his grip on her hand tightened, as if reaffirming his agreement. Their connection was unbreakable. The battle began. The curse figures moved toward them with unnerving speed, shadows that twisted and writhed, as if the very darkness had come to life. Luke's eyes flashed silver, and with a deep growl he shifted, the transformation so seamless it barely made a sound. In his wolf form he was a beast of sheer power, his muscles rippling with every movement, his teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light, his eyes, those eyes that always held such fire, locked onto hers. "Stay close." Luke's voice was barely a whisper, though it held that same command, that same raw dominance. She nodded, her heart racing, but instead of retreating she pressed forward, drawing on the strength they shared. Together they fought. Luke was a whirlwind of violence, moving with lethal precision as he tore through the cursed figures. His wolf was relentless, fierce, unstoppable, but always aware of her, his eyes never straying too far from her presence. Every time a figure came too close, he was there, a blur of fur and power, pushing it back, tearing it apart. But even as he fought, he kept one eye on her, his focus unwavering, his protective instinct never dimming. But Elizabeth was no passive bystander. She fought with everything she had, her fists and feet moving in a fluid, controlled motion. Every time she struck, every time she fought back, it felt like the curse's grip on her loosening. She could feel it, deep inside, the power of their bond coursing through her. It was more than just an emotional connection. It was a force that defied everything. She was no longer just a victim of the curse. She was its equal. She was his equal. With every strike the darkness retreated. Her heart, her love for Luke radiated outward, pushing the shadows back, and when their gazes locked again, the power of their bond surged, electric, unstoppable. Together, Luke's voice rang out, low and fierce. It wasn't a command, it was a promise, and they both knew what it meant. The bond between them flared, an intense pulse of energy that rippled outward, sending waves of power through the cursed figures. The darkness wavered, faltered, and for the first time Elizabeth could feel the curse weakening, could feel it shattering under the force of their combined strength. But the final blow was not without sacrifice. In the chaos of the battle, Elizabeth felt a sharp pain in her side, a sudden, searing burn that made her gasp. She looked down to see dark tendrils wrapping around her, trying to drag her into the depths of the curse's final hold. Her vision blurred, her body weakening under the pressure, but just as the darkness closed in on her, Luke was there, his massive wolf form blocking the blow, his body taking the brunt of the force. "No!" Elizabeth cried out, reaching for him, but he pushed her back, his eyes flashing with pure ferocity. "Stay back," he snarled, his voice pained but determined. "I won't let you fall." With a deep, guttural roar, Luke surged forward, his massive form slamming into the darkness, his claws and teeth raking through it with lethal force. The curse shrieked in pain as the bond between them amplified, the raw power of their connection pushing the darkness into submission. In one final, heart-pounding moment, the curse collapsed. The figures dissipated into nothingness, the power that had once held them in its grip vanishing like smoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, the silence absolute. Luke shifted back into his human form, his body bleeding from the battle, his eyes locked onto Elizabeth as he collapsed beside her. His breath was ragged, but his gaze never left hers. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice full of both exhaustion and something deeper, something that made her heart ache. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, his fingers tender as they cupped her face. "We did it, we're free." Her body trembled as she leaned into him, her heart racing. They had won, but at a cost. The bond between them had been tested, stretched to its breaking point, and yet it had survived. They had survived. "I love you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Luke's lips curled into a soft, exhausted smile. "I love you too, always." The battle was over. The curse was broken. But the greatest victory was the bond they had forged, one that had turned their darkest hour into a promise of light. And as they sat together amidst the ruins of the battle, there was no doubt in their hearts. They had not just survived, they had won. The days following the battle felt like a quiet storm. The curse had been broken, the darkness lifted, but the weight of everything they had endured hung in the air between Elizabeth and Luke. The town was slowly healing, the vibrant life returning to the streets as people came together to rebuild, to forgive, to breathe freely again. But for Elizabeth and Luke, the real healing had only just begun. Elizabeth stood in front of her classroom, her eyes scanning the room filled with eager faces. the faces of children who hadn't witnessed the horror, who had been blissfully unaware of the curse that had hung over them like a shadow. It was strange, returning to normalcy after everything that had happened, but as she watched them, listened to their laughter, her heart swelled with something she had never known before. She wasn't just teaching now. She was shaping the future, sharing her strength with these children, and it felt like a new beginning. She caught the gaze of one of her students, a young boy with dark, curious eyes. He smiled at her, and she returned it, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She was here, she was whole, and she was more than she had been before. "Miss Whitaker, are we going on a field trip soon?" the boy asked, his voice high and hopeful. Elizabeth smiled, her heart light. "Soon, I promise. You'll be the first to know." The class erupted in chatter, and Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude. She was back to a world where the only thing she needed to focus on was the future. And that future, for once, didn't feel as uncertain as it had before. Luke stood at the edge of town, watching the people go about their day. The laughter, the conversations, the sense of peace. It was something he had almost forgotten existed. Before Elizabeth, before the curse, before the darkness. He had been the town's protector for so long, a silent force standing at the edges, watching over everyone, keeping them safe from the shadows. But now, the people didn't just see him as the sheriff, as the wolf. They saw him as a bridge between worlds, between the supernatural and the human. He had helped them find peace, but in doing so, he had found peace within himself as well. His gaze shifted to Elizabeth, watching her as she spoke with her students. She was the light that had guided him out of the shadows. The bond between them, forged in fire, was something neither of them had expected, but something neither of them would ever let go. He had never believed in fate before her, but now he couldn't deny that their connection was more than just love. It was a force, something that had saved them both. He walked toward her, his steps purposeful, the pull to her magnetic. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes softened. She smiled, that smile that had always disarmed him, that smile that told him everything he needed to know. "How's everything going here?" he asked, standing beside her. "Better now," she replied, her voice warm, filled with contentment. She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "How's everything outside the classroom? Are people finally starting to heal?" "Slowly," Luke said, his expression thoughtful. "But they will. We'll rebuild together, and this time we'll do it stronger." Elizabeth nodded, her fingers still intertwined with his. She could feel the strength in him, the quiet power that had always been there. She had known from the moment she met him that there was something about him, something that set him apart. But now, standing here with him, after everything they had been through, she saw it clearly. He was her protector, her partner, her equal. They were in this together, always. "I've been thinking," she said, looking up at him, "about us, about everything that happened. It feels like a lifetime ago, but I know we've only just started." Luke smiled, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "We've come a long way, Elizabeth, and I think we've earned the right to start fresh, to build something new. Together." Her heart swelled as she met his gaze. There were no more doubts between them, no more fears. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and the love between them was something that had been tested, tempered, and emerged stronger than ever. "You're right," she said softly. "We've been through so much, and we'll go through more, but together I know we can handle anything." Luke pulled her into his arms then, his embrace warm and solid, just as it had always been. She sank into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers. In that moment everything felt right. The world was theirs to shape, and as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Weeks passed, and with each day the town grew stronger. Luke and Elizabeth, side by side, had become symbols of the strength of their bond, the force that had turned the tide against the curse. They worked together, Elizabeth with her students, Luke with his people, helping the town rebuild, heal, and grow. The town's residents, once wary and divided, now found themselves united in their gratitude. not just for their safety, but for the love that had saved them all. There were still whispers of the supernatural world, of the things that had been hidden for so long. But the people no longer feared them. They embraced the unknown, knowing that no matter what came, they had Luke and Elizabeth to guide them. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Elizabeth leaned into Luke, her hand resting on his chest, his arm wrapped around her, pulling her closer. "We've come a long way," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with confidence. "We have," Luke agreed, his lips brushing her forehead, "and we've only just begun." They sat in silence, their hearts beating as one, knowing that their future was limitless. Together they had overcome darkness, found light, and now, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, they knew one thing for certain. Their love was a force that nothing, not the curse, not the shadows, could ever tear apart. They were ready for whatever came next, together, always. Elizabeth stepped into the lively crowd at the annual harvest festival, the warmth of the evening air filled with the sounds of laughter, the steady beat of folk music, and the sharp scent of caramel apples. The town was vibrant, alive with the spirit of the harvest, and there was an undeniable energy in the air, a mix of celebration and something else she couldn't quite place. Children darted past her laughing, their faces painted with bright colours. Stalls lined the streets selling handmade goods and homemade treats. Lanterns hung from the trees, their golden light casting a soft glow over everything, while the smell of roasted corn and fresh pies teased her senses. She found herself wandering toward a booth that sold local crafts, her fingers brushing over the intricately woven scarves and pottery, but her mind wasn't entirely focused on the wares. She hadn't been in town long, but something about this festival, the energy, the togetherness, felt like the missing piece to the quiet life she'd sought. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the chaos of her old life. That's when she saw him. Across the crowd, a man stood near the edge of the festival, his broad frame leaning casually against a lamppost, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. He had the kind of presence that made you take notice. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his sharp jawline and rugged features gave him an almost predatory look. But it was the way he held himself, confident, composed, that drew her in. He wasn't just another man at the festival. There was something else about him, something that felt different, something that made her pulse pick up in an unexpected rush. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes snapped to hers, locking with hers across the distance. The world seemed to narrow down to that single moment, their gazes colliding with an intensity that stole her breath. His eyes were dark, not just from the night, but filled with something else, something fierce, something guarded. But there was also a softness, a warmth that contradicted the dangerous edge in his posture. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, the pull to him so strong it felt like it was coming from somewhere deep inside. His expression remained unreadable, but there was no mistaking the flicker of something, recognition, passing between them. She couldn't tear her eyes away, and neither could he. Her breath hitched, her mind spinning. It was just a look, nothing more, but it felt like more, much more. Finally, as if shaken from the spell, Luke pushed off the post and started toward her, his movements smooth and purposeful. Her stomach fluttered at the approach, her heart thudding in her chest as he closed the distance between them. "Enjoying the festival?" His voice was deep, with a rich timbre that resonated in her chest. There was a calmness to him, but also something that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Yeah," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady but the tremor of excitement barely contained. "It's a nice change from the city." She found herself stepping closer almost instinctively, as if she wanted to be near him, to close the distance that felt too far. He nodded, his gaze moving over her with a quiet intensity as if weighing her words. "It's a good place to reset." His eyes narrowed slightly and his lips curled into a knowing smile. "I'm Luke, sheriff of this fine town." Elizabeth couldn't help the small, surprised laugh that escaped her lips. "You're the sheriff?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He had the kind of presence that suggested authority, but she hadn't expected him to be the one in charge here. "Yeah," he said with a simple shrug, his expression a mix of self-awareness and amusement. "It's a quiet job around here, most of the time." There was an edge to his words, a hint that the quiet wasn't as serene as it appeared. "And you are—" "Elizabeth." She offered her hand, and he took it without hesitation, his grip strong but not overpowering. His touch sent a shiver through her, a spark that ignited something deep inside. She noticed the calluses on his fingers, the small signs of someone who worked hard, someone who knew his way around a dangerous world. "You're new in town?" he asked, his voice low as his gaze held hers a little longer than necessary, a flash of something deep, as though he was trying to figure her out. "Yeah, just moved here recently," she said, her heart skipping a beat under the weight of his stare. "Needed a change of scenery." "I get that," Luke said, his lips quirking into a smile. "Sometimes we all need a fresh start." His eyes softened just slightly, the usual hardness in his gaze fading for a moment. "I think you'll like it here. There's something special about this place." Elizabeth nodded, her chest tightening at the way his words settled over her. Something special, she felt it too, the pull of something ancient, something that wasn't just in the town, but in the way Luke made her feel. "Do you always work the festivals?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Not usually," he said, his smile deepening. "But tonight felt different. I figured I'd keep an eye on things." The way he said it made it clear he was more than capable of handling whatever came his way. There was no arrogance in his voice, only the quiet confidence that came with knowing what you were capable of, and knowing how to protect those around you. They stood there for a beat, a comfortable silence falling between them, the hum of the festival continuing around them. But the air between them was charged, the weight of their unspoken connection hanging heavy. Elizabeth shifted, not wanting to break the moment, but also unsure of how to continue. "So, do you have any recommendations? What's good here?" Luke chuckled, a low rumbling sound that made her heart flutter. "The caramel apples are a must," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "And if you're feeling brave, try the haunted house over there. Some of the local kids are too jumpy to work it, but it's a good laugh." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, her smile playful. "Sounds like something I'd survive." His smile deepened, but there was something almost predatory about the way he looked at her now. "I think you do more than survive." His words lingered in the space between them, charged with an energy she couldn't quite understand, but couldn't ignore. Something about him made her feel both exposed and safe, a paradox that stirred a quiet hunger deep inside. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice a little breathless, though she wasn't sure why. Luke took a step back, his gaze never leaving hers. "Maybe I'll see you around then. It's a small town, after all." She nodded, her chest tight as she tried to steady her breathing. "Maybe." As he turned to walk away, a flicker of something, of recognition, of something more, lingered in the space between them, and as much as she tried to ignore it, she knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross.